Hey folks, this is Ted Conover. I thought for week two I'd do some sort of an informal presentation for my week two readings. I'm going to be doing a lot of contextualizing this week's readings and some of last week's readings into my context. So just a little reminder, background information. I am a high school teacher. I teach composition and intro to literature dual credit courses where students can get college credit. I also teach um, grades 7 through 12 with core English. And so my context is different than for many of you. Because of this, occasionally I have to I seem like I've been grasping at relevance with the 2 weeks of readings. And just as kind of a little example to help bring that into perspective, here's a picture of my seventh grade English class last year during Halloween. Just some crazy teenage hormones happening in this picture and just my daily life. And so this last week being the first week of school, I was all gung-ho about, trying to implement some of these ideas and look for examples from our week's readings in my daily classroom. And, I start out with seventh grade homeroom and I look out and you see all kinds of nuttiness. Braden is sniffing his armpits in the corner while Aiden is narrating it inappropriately, and Jenna is recording it with her cell phone to put onto Snapchat. And I sort of had this realization that the world of the ivory tower in which our readings in this class sort of exists doesn't always totally translate over into my context. But the more reflecting I do, the more relevance I see within that, within my class and within my context, even though occasionally I have to kind of do a little bit of mental gymnastics to do so, because so much of what we read is based in college classrooms. And so I saw a lot of relevance in my classroom and my curriculum from this week's readings. Starting with Yancey, I was jumping for joy reading this chapter from first year composition, being like, yes, here's some actual things that she does in her composition classroom, things I can visualize. And it was a little less philosophical, a little bit less broad. And so I found this to be incredibly helpful. And I was just very excited to read this. So, anyway, she starts out talking about how first year composition has simply too many outcomes to meet the expectations put onto first year composition instructors by other upper level instructors and professors, hoping that they can teach students how to write so that they don't have to teach them how to write. Students should be able to master grammar, master style and citations, all this other stuff, and be able to actually write well and coherently and be creative. And there's just simply too many things for a first year composition student to accomplish in this semester long class. And I totally saw what she was talking about when she wrote about that. Although I will say that from Yancey's perspective, my context is a little bit backwards. And what I mean by that is she writes a lot about first year composition being this foundational course upon which all other college coursework is built upon, right? It's like a first course that students need to do. It's a basic skill to be able to learn how to write in an academic setting in order to be successful in upper level classes in their major. In my setting, composition is the highest level elective that a student can take at the end of their high school career. And so it's sort of, instead of this bottom up, it's this top down type of thing. But upon reflection, I've been thinking that it's not so different, in that I hope that students who take my composition course can go forward and use their transfer credits to do well, and that their college professors or their community college professors say, hey, this kid really knows how to write. This is good. Your high school teacher who taught this dual credit course did a good job. And I hope that professors aren't like, oh no, this student came from a dual credit class. This was taught in the high school. I'm going to have to do lots of remedial work. And so I'm conscious of that, although I'm not hearing the same sort of griping that I would if I was teaching within an institution where I was teaching first year composition. And so it's just a little bit different for me, and is, I guess, my main point there. So moving on, I found what Yancey wrote about Bloom's taxonomy to be something that I need to improve in. So just to review a little bit, she talks about how students learn facts, they engage with concepts, they need to practice, and then the highest level of what they need to do is they need to reflect to engage metacognitive practices so that they're able to articulate what they think they've learned. That comes right from Yancey. And I think I do a good job with everything up to reflection. I do a really poor job with reflection. Last year was the first year I taught a composition course, and I had a draft reflection assignment that students need to do with each essay that they turned in, where I asked them to write about how did you start, what did you improve on, what did you learn about the writing process throughout the revisions that we did and the editing process, from the first draft to the final draft that you turned in for credit. And overall, these reflections were not good. I was not happy with what I got. It was mostly like, I didn't know what a comma splice was. Now I know what a comma splice is. I fixed my errors with tense shifts, all the obvious things. There was no real reflection happening. Students weren't really having any sort of valuable metacognition that was happening, so that they could recognize when they were being successful and what they did to be successful, and when they were struggling and what they could do to change that. And so, frankly, over time, I just stopped asking for these reflections because I felt like it was a waste of their time and a waste of my time. So a goal for myself for this year is to try and do a much better job with getting students to reflect on the revision process so that they are able to take these skills away, so that they don't just use them once with one paper and forget about them and not actually improve as writers overall. So reading about that in Yancey's chapter helped to inspire me to do better with that. And it just reminded me that I did a poor job of it last year. Moving on to what she talked about with the narrative essay, I found it to be interesting and also kind of contradictory to what I've been told from working with my faculty mentor. So just a little bit of background knowledge for those of you who don't know how dual credit courses work. Because I'm teaching a college level course, students can get college credit through a sister institution. In my case, it's a community college in Duluth called Lake Superior College, and I'm a high school teacher. I need to work with a faculty mentor, an instructor who teaches that course at the community college to help align my course with hers, and so that she can just do general quality control and make sure I'm doing it in a way that is rigorous enough. And so she shared her syllabus with me last year and said, and I was surprised to see that a narrative essay was not on it. So I asked her about it because narrative essay sort of being common practice of being the first essay that students write in a first year composition course. This is the first essay that I wrote in my first year composition course when I was in college. And she said that she used to do a narrative essay, but that she was so frustrated with the results and that students were not really learning good habits, and that they were just, it was too complicated for students to do for a first essay. And so she decided to not do a narrative essay at all, which I found to be interesting because it kind of goes against what Yancey wrote about, with the narrative essay sort of being a natural thing for students to do because they're used to reading narrative texts, and it sort of empowers their authority because they're writing about their own life experiences. However, with really novice writers, it can be a difficult thing to do because you have to write using scenes, you have to transition and take time into account, you have to focus on details that are important. Sometimes the topics for narrative essays from young students are way too ambitious. Maybe it's some trauma that they've gone through. Maybe it's some sort of emotional thing that they haven't yet really processed, and they're trying to process it through this essay. I see that a lot, especially with adolescent students, is that they try to process their trauma and things they've gone through the writing process, which is really great. But also, the writing tends to suffer because they're not really ready to write about it, and they focus on working through their emotions, and they are not working on focusing on making good, coherent writing. And so it just ends up being a little too ambitious, and then it becomes a revision wormhole. And that's what my faculty mentor said to me. So I like narrative essays. I did not do a narrative essay last year, but I'm looking to rework it in. Probably not with the first essay, but maybe later on as the semester goes on, once I equip students with some skills to be able to take on the complexity of that assignment. The next article that I read was Fulkerson's Forced Philosophies Composition. And I found this article to be so helpful for me because I recognized a major mistake I was making last year in my composition course and in other courses that I teach as well. And this relates to the value mode confusion, right, with the four philosophies. And it's totally true. This quote, "Problems are more of mindlessness than of maliciousness," where if you confuse students, it's more from mindlessness than maliciousness. And I recognized a few instances specifically where I did that. And now I'm equipped to be able to figure out how I can remedy that. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about that specifically. In my composition course, students have to write an argument essay. It's part of one of the outcomes of the course. They have to. And so my approach is mostly expressivist, right? The argument essay is the third essay that I teach and that students write. The first two are very much based on personal experiences and personal narratives. They're not narrative essays per se, but they're very much based on trying to get students to leverage their own personal experiences to build some confidence to write with authority. And then I have them write about a topic that is very broad, perhaps something that's maybe in the news, politics, all this stuff, and I expect them to write with authority on it. And so suddenly I go from an expressivist toward more of a mimetic approach. And students really struggled with this, and I did not understand why they struggled with it so much, but they really did. And so I'm going to show you an example. This is just an outline. And clearly this student didn't really understand how to do an outline either because it's mostly paragraphs. But this student decided to write about schizophrenia for her argument essay. And her thesis was that schizophrenia is stigmatized and that we need to understand it better in order to help people with schizophrenia more and to not rely on these stereotypical stigmatizations. So it was an interesting topic and a good thesis, I thought. But where the issue came in was that she was trying to write very broadly about stigmatization of mental illness, but was doing so totally based on a family member she had who suffered from schizophrenia. So the stigmatization was based on this one individual. And she was trying to make these broad claims about how stigmatization works. And it was just based on this one very specific example. So she was picking up that I was wanting her to do this expressivist approach based on personal experiences from the first two essays, but that in the argument essays, I wanted her to make these more broad claims and talk about the issue from a broader perspective than just her own personal perspective. So she really struggled with this, and especially when she was trying to bring in sources on this, it just really didn't make sense. She contradicted herself. She tried to make these sources work, but she was just very confused. And I was confused to why it was not working. But now I can understand that it was value mode confusion totally on my part. And so this year, I need to ask students to take this into account. I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to do that yet. Maybe if you some of you have some advice for me, which would be wonderful. I would very much welcome that. But I just need to be more aware of it. Now that I'm aware of it, I think I can address it a little bit better. And this was interesting for me because in Fulkerson's article, he talks about this exact assignment, right? On page 347. I'm just going to read right from the article. A fairly common writing assignment, for example, directs the student to, quote, state and explain clearly your opinion about X. There's nothing wrong with such an assignment, but if a student does state his or her opinion, and if the opinion happens to be based on gross ignorance or to contain major contradictions, the teacher must, to be consistent, ignore such matters. The topic, as stated, asks for opinion. It does not ask for good opinion, judged by whatever philosophy. And so that's what I need to do when I reconstruct my prompt. I need to think about it in terms of maybe a more expressivist approach. Or I need to explicitly tell students, okay, for these first two essays, we've looked at personal experiences. Now you can certainly use personal experiences in your own in your argument essay, but I'm looking for you to make a broader approach based on sound reasoning, something like that. So now that I'm more aware of it, I think I can begin to grapple with it a little bit better. More on the Fulkerson a little bit. His description of the mimetic approach really helped me understand. I think I'm going to say his name right. I'm sorry if I'm not. I'm very sorry. Bartholomew. Bartholomew is inventing the university. Some of you responded to my prompt last week, and I think I got a little overzealous in trying to take on Bartholomew last week in some of the issues I had with his points in inventing the university, and I think I got a little carried away, to be honest with you. And so now I understand it a little bit better. With the mimetic approach, I'm saying, okay, that makes sense. I do, though, want to talk about when Fulkerson writes about this point-counterpoint essay research. So talking about on page 345 of this article, he talks about one resulting methodology is to emphasize research during the pre-writing stages. This is for the mimetic approach, so that it helps build students' authority. Another is to emphasize heuristic systems. Still another is the use of topically arranged anthology of readings. If a student reads 4 essays taking both sides of a controversial issue, say capital punishment, then he or she supposedly will know enough to be able to write about that topic. That is, the writing will be closer to, quote, the real thing and thus better from a mimetic perspective. Talking about this anthology approach for doing research, when I read that, I thought, okay, students are just going to mimic these 4 arguments or the point counterpoint type of thing. They're just absolutely going to mimic the style and the format probably of these essays if I ask them to write an essay that is taking on the same question. And so I thought to myself, okay, is that bad? Is that a bad thing? Is mimicry a bad thing, even though it might seem at first glance to be, especially with novice writers, and they're trying to build their skills and put together some skills in their toolbox. They have to start somewhere, and by mimicking good writers, I think is a decent place to start. And I was wondering what some of you might think about that, if mimicry in a beginning stage is an okay thing for you, or if it's something that we should avoid as writing teachers. And so my takeaway overall from the Fulkerson article is that from the 4 philosophies in evaluation and with assessment, and also just with the lead up and explaining the essay assignment and just our general expectations as students is we got to ask for what we want. I have to ask for what I want explicitly, and I have to be aware of unconscious modal confusion and bias in this case. And so now I'm equipped to do that. And so I've come out the other side of reading this article very pleased. Okay, Next article I read was Crowley's Composition is Not Rhetoric. This is one of the articles where I felt like the connection to my context maybe isn't totally sound. I was kind of like, okay, I understand your main point, that composition strips all the invention away and therefore is not rhetoric. I agree with her, but from my standpoint, students don't necessarily have the skills to be able to do some of the more sophisticated work that she wrote about as being more valuable. And so if I were to ask them to do that, it really wouldn't be fair to them, and they would probably just sort of entrench their bad habits. But one connection I saw is she wrote about the 5-paragraph essay on the second to last paragraph of her article. And she writes about it sort of using it as an example of modern day composition and how it's taken away all the invention and has sort of killed the creativity of all writers. And the quote is, invention was reduced to selection of a subject to write about, and where arrangement was reified into the 5-paragraph theme. I fear his analysis also describes much of the process pedagogy that is practiced inside the first year requirement. So it's pretty clear she takes issue with the 5-paragraph essay. A lot of people take issue with the 5-paragraph essay, and that's fine. I can see where they're coming from. I agree with critics of the 5-paragraph essay in that it doesn't go far enough to help students be creative and to take on more ambitious topics and to grow as writers more. It kind of boxes them in. But I don't see it as evil, and I'm guessing that many of you have very formed opinions about this, and so this is sort of a call to hear what people have to say about the 5-paragraph essay. Some students need that format in order to fall back on. Otherwise, their writing just becomes totally incoherent, especially with my younger students, with junior high and with 9th grade as well. They need that structure. Otherwise, they will get lost and their points will be lost. That being said, in a college setting, I think a first-year composition is a good place to move away from the 5-paragraph essay format for sure and to challenge it. But I don't see it as an inherently evil thing, even though it does simplify writing, and it does box in some kids and some students who might be able to write more interesting and complex essays if they weren't shackled to this 5-paragraph theme format. And so kind of coming back to this, looking at this from my setting, is I can see where Crowley's coming from, but I am a little bit skeptical that students in my setting would be able to handle the type of sophistication she thinks is being such a good thing. I don't know. Maybe I'm not giving them enough credit, but I think I tend to know my students pretty well. And again, maybe she would say, well, I'm talking about a college course here. I'm not talking about a high school course or in a high school setting necessarily. So she might take issue with my argument and say, you're comparing apples to oranges here. And I could see where that's coming from as well. Okay, moving on. Last article I read was The Miller, The Formation of College English. This gave a really interesting background of the formation of college English courses and departments, mostly in Scotland and Ireland and in America. And it really brought into focus Hess's argument from last week, as in addition to what was written about the students' right movement, what I learned about the students' right movement, and that is basically English departments are cultural and enforcing cultural and linguistic hegemony and cultural assimilation. And that seemed to be the case with many of these first English departments. And that is they were trying to assimilate themselves into the more elite English culture, even though they were occasionally challenging it at the same time. So I can see where this is coming from. And it gave a lot of perspective for me, especially looking at the students' rights movement. Going back to more of a philosophical question, And again, I'm sure many of you have very formed opinions about this as well. I wrote about this a little bit in the first week in my responses to people's posts, but I'm wondering, is the expectation of academic style oppression in 2019 in your context, in people's opinions? I tend to think not so much, especially with my own students, where I'm not necessarily destroying their own ways of speaking. I'm not saying that they're bad. And many students come from homes, most of my students, in fact, come from homes and contexts and cultures where their modes of speaking are pretty close to standard English. And so enforcing standard English isn't really forcing them to assimilate into a culture that's not their own and devaluing it. I don't know. I just want to know what people have to say about this, because my thoughts are not super formed about it, and so I'd love to hear what you have to say. All right, I'm going to wrap it up. Thanks, peeps.